In the last section, we created our Redux store inside the index.js file and wired up the store to our component hierarchy thanks to the provider tag provided to us by the React Redux library. We're now going to progress on to creating all the different reducers, or at least one reducer for right now, that's going to be used inside of our Redux store. We'll create the reducer, we'll then import it into this index.js file, and replace this little dummy reducer right here with the real one that we want to use inside of our application. Now, as a reminder, we're going to have two distinct reducers, at least, inside of our application. The first is the auth reducer that is going to be responsible for deciding whether or not the user is currently logged in. And the second will be a surveys reducer, which is responsible for recording a list of all the different surveys that a user has created. Now, over time, we might add in a couple other reducers if required, but for right now, I feel pretty confident that this will at least get us started. We're not going to create the surveys reducer just yet. We'll come back to that later after we've kind of implemented surveys a little bit on the backend server. So for right now, I want to create a file to house our auth reducer. I want to pass it to our combine reducers call, and then pass that off to our Redux store. So I'm going to change back over to my code editor. We're going to create a new folder to house all the different reducers inside of our application. So inside of the src directory, I'll make a new folder called reducers. And do triple check your spelling on reducers. Very common typo I do is to flip the R and the E in there. Really easy typo to make. Inside the reducers directory, we're going to immediately create two different files. One is going to be intended to house the auth reducer. So I'm going to make auth reducer.js. And do note that I'm using a lowercase a here to indicate that we are going to export a function from this file as opposed to a component class or something like that. Then the second file I'm going to make is going to be called an index.js file. So index.js. Now immediately, yes, we do now have two index.js files inside of our project. I know this is a pain. I know it's something that is tough to get used to. The purpose of calling these files index.js is to allow us to simply import the reducers directory, which by convention with import statements will automatically give us any file inside that directory that is called index.js. So if you don't like the fact that we now have two index.js files, trust me, I'm with you. I don't really care for it myself, but it is definitely convention inside of React and Redux projects. So we're sticking with convention here. Okay, we'll first start off inside the auth reducer file. So I'm now inside of authreducer.js. Inside of here, we're going to create a reducer and immediately export it. Now, as a reminder, kind of assuming here that we're all at least passingly familiar with reducers, we kind of have a sense of what they do. If you're not familiar with all this stuff, if I'm moving too fast at this point, remember you can always look up some of the different resources I've attached to the end of the course and get a little refresher on Redux and how it works, okay? So inside the auth reducer file, we'll place our export default statement. We're going to export a function. The function will be called with two arguments. The first will be our state object that is responsible for this reducer. And then the second object, or second argument I should say, will be our action object. Inside of the reducer, we'll switch over the actions type. Right now, we don't have any types defined inside of our application. So I'm going to assume that we're just going to have a single case, the default case, default, from which we will just return our state. So we're going to assume, hey, no change to state is necessary, just return our state object, like so. Okay, so then the last thing we have to do inside of here, remember that our state object initially starts off as undefined, so we have to provide some initial value for it. So in this case, I'm just going to assume that our initial state is going to be an empty object. Now, incredibly likely that we'll come back and change this at some point in the future, but for right now, I think it's a good starting place. Okay, so here's our auth reducer. This is looking pretty good. Let's take a quick break. When we return, we're going to import this into our reducers index.js file. We'll then wire it up with a combine reducers call, and then hook that up to the Redux store inside of our root index.js file. So I'll see you in just a second.